All right, so let's dive into a topic today that I think you'll find really, really fascinating. It's one that we all hear about all the time, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I know you've probably seen the headlines, you've heard the arguments, but we're going to go deeper than that today. We're going to be doing a deep dive into a 2003 report by the Carter Center. And what makes this report so interesting is that it analyzes this conflict by looking at what's worked and what hasn't worked in other historical conflicts around the world.
Yeah, it's kind of like taking this really unique approach. It's like holding up a mirror to history to see, what lessons we can learn, and believe me, there are some really surprising insights in this report.
So to start off, can you just kind of paint a picture for us of what was the situation on the ground back in 2003?
Yeah, so the report, it doesn't try to sugarcoat anything. It really lays out all of the harsh realities that both Israelis and Palestinians were facing at the time. For example, suicide bombings were having this just devastating impact on Israeli society.
Yeah, I can only imagine the fear and anger those attacks must have generated.
Oh, absolutely. And on the Palestinian side, the economy was just in ruins. The report actually compares living conditions to what they were before 1967. That's how bad things had gotten.
Wow, that's incredibly tough. So they're basically going back decades in terms of economic development.
Exactly. And then, of course, on top of that, you had the rise of Hamas, which really just added another layer of complexity to the Palestinian political landscape.
So you've got these incredibly difficult conditions on both sides, and yet the report talks about this idea of tactical hawks, strategic doves. What does that even mean?
It's a fascinating concept, and essentially what it means is that public opinion on both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side was much more nuanced than a lot of people think.
So it's not just as simple as being pro-peace or anti-peace.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
So tactical hawks refers to the fact that there was widespread support for some pretty tough security measures, things like targeted assassinations or military incursions. And you can definitely understand why, given the constant threat of violence.
Right, when you feel like you're under attack, you want to feel protected.
Exactly, and that's where the strategic doves part comes in. Because even while supporting these kind of tough tactics, a majority on both sides still ultimately wanted a peaceful two-state solution. They just couldn't see a clear path to get there at that particular moment.
So they were hawkish in the short term, but dovish in their long-term vision. That's a really important distinction. So it means you can't just look at someone's immediate actions. You really have to try to understand their underlying hopes and fears as well.
Absolutely, and that's why this whole concept of tactical hawks, strategic doves,
Yeah.
is so crucial for anyone who's really trying to understand this conflict. It reminds us that, things are very rarely black and white. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of complexity.
For sure. Okay, so we've got this picture of 2003, a really difficult time for both Israelis and Palestinians. But what I find so interesting about this Carter Center report is how it goes beyond just describing the situation and actually tries to look for potential solutions by looking at other historical conflicts.
Right. Yeah, it's all about kind of drawing these parallels, trying to find those common threads that run through different peace processes.
So what kind of patterns did they uncover?
Well, one of the key takeaways is that peace processes, they're rarely a straight shot to the solution. It's not like you can just flip a switch and suddenly everything's peaceful.
More like a winding road with lots of twists and turns.
Exactly. The report talks about how peace processes, they often move in these phases where you have periods of progress and then you have setbacks. And sometimes it even feels like you're taking steps backward.
It's that 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing.
Precisely. And that's something that's really important to remember. Because it's easy to get discouraged when you see those setbacks happen. But this report suggests that those backward steps can actually be a part of the larger process, the necessary part of finding that common ground.
So patience is key. No quick fixes.
Definitely not. And this kind of leads into another really interesting point that the report makes, which is the importance of including potential spoilers in the peace process.
Okay, now hold on a second. By spoilers, you mean groups or individuals who are actually trying to sabotage the peace process, right?
Exactly, yeah. Those who might resort to violence or other tactics to try to disrupt the negotiations and prevent a settlement.
So they're spoilers in the sense that they're trying to spoil the peace. But why on earth would you want to include them? Wouldn't that just make things even more difficult?
Well, that's the counterintuitive part, right? But the report argues that trying to exclude these groups entirely, it can actually backfire. It might just drive them further underground or make them even more extreme. So it's better to try to find ways to bring them into the conversation, even if it's in a limited way at first.
I can see how that would be tricky, though. especially if these groups are really committed to violence or just fundamentally opposed to compromise. How do you even begin to engage with them?
Yeah, it's definitely a delicate process, and the report kind of suggests that. You can differentiate between what they call dealers and zealots. So dealers, they argue, are often motivated by specific grievances or goals that might be addressed through negotiation.
Okay, so they might be willing to bargain, to make a deal, if
Wait,
their demands are met.
exactly. Whereas zealots, they're a lot more driven by ideology or certain beliefs
Yeah.
that make compromise a lot more difficult. They're not really interested in pragmatic solutions. They're more focused on kind of pursuing their vision no matter what the cost.
So you focus on bringing the dealers to the table and try to contain or neutralize the zealots.
Yeah, that's one approach. And the report also points out that, former spoilers, those who have renounced violence and joined the peace process, they can actually play a really crucial role in this as well.
I see, because they speak the language. They understand the mindset.
Exactly. They've been there. They know what it's like to be on the other side, so they can sometimes reach people in a way that others can't.
Okay, so dealing with spoilers, that's one big challenge.
Yeah.
What else does this report highlight?
Well, another key takeaway is that leaders need to prepare their people for compromise. You can't just spring a peace agreement on a population that's been engaged in a prolonged conflict and expect them to embrace it wholeheartedly.
Yeah, that makes sense. People need time to process,
Yeah.
to understand what's being given up and what's being gained, especially when there's so much history involved, so much pain.
Absolutely. And that preparation, it takes time. It takes dialogue. It takes building trust. And that's no easy feat in a conflict like this, where there's so much mistrust and animosity.
So it's about managing expectations, creating a climate where compromise is seen as a strength, not a weakness.
Exactly. And then finally, the report highlights this really fascinating concept of ripeness. It argues that not every conflict is ready for resolution. At any given moment, there are certain conditions that need to be in place for peace to actually take hold.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Ripeness, what does that even mean in the context of a conflict?
Well, it means that there needs to be what they call a mutually hurting stalemate, meaning both sides have kind of reached this point where they recognize that continuing the conflict is simply too costly, too destructive.
They're both hurting enough to be open to alternatives.
Yes, but that's not enough on its own. There also needs to be a perceived way out, some sense that a negotiated solution is actually possible. Without that hope, even if both sides are hurting, they're more likely to just kind of dig in their heels and keep fighting.
So it's a combination of pain and a glimmer of hope that creates the right conditions for resolution.
Exactly. It's like, reaching that point where you realize you've been banging your head against a wall for too long and you finally start looking for a door.
That's a powerful analogy. And it makes me wonder,
Yeah.
how do you foster that sense of hope, that belief that a better future is possible, especially in a conflict as protracted and as complex as this one?
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting. And that's where the report's specific recommendations for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict come in. Because it's not just about these abstract theories of peace processes. It's about practical steps that can be taken to move things forward.
So we've talked about those universal dynamics of peace processes. And now I'm really curious to hear what this report recommends specifically for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting is that the report really emphasizes this kind of two-pronged approach. It's not just about the official diplomacy.
Right, not just what happens behind closed doors.
Exactly. It's also about what's happening, like on the ground at the grassroots level.
Okay.
The report calls for, creating spaces where Israelis and Palestinians can come together, not to negotiate treaties or anything, but just to talk to each other, to share their stories and experiences, to try to build some kind of understanding.
So fostering empathy and connection rather than just arguing about politics.
Precisely, it's about creating a climate where peace starts to feel possible, even if the political solutions haven't been completely hammered out yet.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But how do you actually do that? I mean, how do you get people to even want to talk to each other after years and years of conflict and mistrust?
Well, that's where what they call unofficial actors come in. People from civil society groups, community organizations, even just ordinary citizens who are really committed to peace.
Right.
They can organize workshops, dialogues, cultural exchanges, all sorts of activities that help people see each other as human beings rather than, just enemies.
So it's about building bridges, breaking down those walls that
Yeah.
have been erected over decades.
Exactly. And the report also talks about the importance of preparing communities for compromise, which, like we talked about earlier, is really crucial.
Yeah.
You can't just spring a peace agreement on people and expect them to just embrace it. There needs to be that process of dialogue, education, and trust building.
Right, because compromise, especially in a conflict like this, can feel like a huge risk.
Mm.
You're asking people to let go of some really deeply held beliefs,
Yep.
maybe even acknowledge the other side's perspective.
And that is incredibly difficult, but it's also essential if you actually want to achieve a lasting peace. And that's why supporting those moderate voices on both sides is so important.
Yeah.
These are the people who are willing to take those risks to advocate for peace, even when it's unpopular.
Bridge builders, the ones who dare to imagine a different future.
Exactly. They're the ones who will ultimately make peace possible, but they need support. They need encouragement, and a lot of times they even need protection.
Yeah.
Because, let's be honest, they often face a lot of pressure and even threats from those who oppose compromise.
Absolutely. So creating a space for those voices to be heard is crucial. And this report also talks about addressing historical grievances, which, in a conflict as old and as complex as this one, must be a monumental task.
It is a monumental task. It's about acknowledging past wrongs, listening to each other's stories, and trying to find ways to heal those wounds. This isn't about rewriting history or assigning blame.
Right.
It's about creating a shared understanding of the past that allows for a more peaceful future.
Creating a narrative that allows both sides to move forward without feeling like they're abandoning their history or their identity.
Exactly. Now, remember, this report came out in 2003, and at that time, there was a lot of hope surrounding what was called the Quartet's Roadmap for Peace.
Right.
This was a plan backed by the EU, Russia, and the UN that was really aiming to achieve a two-state solution through kind of a phased process.
Yeah. I remember that being a big deal at the time. So what were the key elements of that plan?
Well, in a nutshell, it involved a commitment to ending the violence and implementing certain reforms on the Palestinian side, followed by some confidence-building measures from both sides, and then ultimately leading to negotiations on final status issues like borders, Jerusalem, and refugees.
So a step-by-step process trying to build trust and momentum along the way.
Exactly. And while the roadmap ultimately didn't fully achieve its goals, it did represent a significant international effort to try to address the conflict.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, the challenges of 2003, the dynamics of peace processes, and this report's recommendations. What's the key takeaway for our listener today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that there's no magic bullet, There's no one-size-fits-all solution to a conflict as complex as this one.
Right.
It really requires that multifaceted approach that combines the official diplomacy with those grassroots peace-building efforts, It's about addressing both the political realities and the human needs.
It's a reminder that peace isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice, understanding, and empathy.
Beautifully put, and that's something we all have a role to play in creating, whether we're diplomats or activists or, just concerned citizens trying to understand the world around us.
And speaking of understanding, this report mentions the potential for reconciliation through symbolic gestures. I'm curious, what kind of gestures could really help build trust between Israelis and Palestinians? What do you think?
That's a great question, and one that I'm going to leave our listeners to ponder.
A little food for thought.
What acts of empathy? What displays of shared humanity could really break down those walls of mistrust and create a space for healing?
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We hope you've gained some new insights and that you'll continue to explore and engage with this really important issue.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.